He will then be followed by the chairperson of the Council for the Built Environment, Ms. Amelia Mtsiali, who will speak on the importance of CBE's role in undertaking these investigations and how the findings will contribute to strengthening South Africa's built environment. Thereafter, the CEO of the Council for the Built Environment, Dr. Mzi Miyeza, will take us through the detailed findings arising from each of these individual investigations. Once all three of these presentations have been completed, we'll open up the floor for questions to members of the media. For those joining online, Vanessa Mukaila from GSAS will coordinate the online questions, so you can direct him to her. Questions can be submitted on the WhatsApp group, both the Public Works and GSAS WhatsApp group. And then, as protocol, as we've done with all other press conferences, just important to note that we're not doing any one-on-one interviews following the press conference. So if you have any questions or answers, please be sure to ask them during the question and answer session. Thereafter, without any further delay, I'm going to hand over to the Minister to deliver his high-level remarks. Minister, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's not so bad. One more day before the weekend. Let me greet the chairperson of the Council for the Built Environment, Ms. Amelia Mtsiali, the CEO of the CBE, Dr. Miyeza, as well as department officials and representatives here today. This morning, I'm here to present the findings of investigations into 4 serious building and construction incidents which have occurred in the country between December 2025 and March of this year. These investigations were commissioned against the backdrop of a deeply concerning period for building safety in the country. On the 6th of May 2024, a multi-story residential building under construction in George collapsed, claiming 34 lives. That tragedy resulted in an extensive investigation through the Council for the Built Environment, which identified serious failures across different parts of the regulatory, professional and construction system. But George was not the last serious incident. On the 12th of December last year, a 5-story building under construction at the River Ranch Temple site in Redcliffe, Verulam, collapsed, killing 5 people and injuring 11. On the 28th of December, a 2-story portion of a residential structure in Doornkop in Soweto collapsed, killing 3 members of one family and injuring 3 others. On the 17th of February this year, temporary formwork failed at the Magnolia residential development in Sea Point, Cape Town, injuring 4 workers. And then on the 2nd of March, part of an industrial building under construction on Omonde, Johannesburg collapsed, killing 9 workers and injuring 6 people. Across the 4 investigations we are reporting on today, 17 people have lost their life and 24 people have been injured. These incidents demand more from government than simply expressing our sympathies and condolences. They require us to provide answers. They also require that we establish whether these incidents are isolated or whether they point towards broader weaknesses in the system responsible for ensuring that buildings in South Africa are safely planned, designed, approved, and constructed. Following the Omonde collapse in Johannesburg, I said that we needed to be frank in acknowledging that repeated building collapses point to deeper structural issues that must be urgently reviewed to improve building safety and construction oversight. I said then that as we work to turn South Africa into a construction site, it is critical that we do so in an environment where building construction can be trusted and the loss of life avoided. In fact, I said we need to move to a zero tolerance for death and injury in construction. The investigations we are presenting today provide important evidence with which to assess this failed. They examined the technical circumstances surrounding each incident. They examined whether the appropriate building approvals and construction permits were in place, and they consider whether suitably registered and competent building environment professionals have been appointed. They also consider whether construction was being properly supervised and inspected. And they also examined whether municipalities, regulators, and others responsible were able to identify and intervene where construction was unsafe or unlawful. The first important conclusion is that these 4 incidents were not the same. Each occurred in different circumstances and had different immediate causes. We should therefore not present every collapse as evidence of precisely the same failure. In particular, the Magnolia incident is materially different from the fatal incidents in Redcliffe, Doornkop, and Ormonde. But when the investigations are considered together, they identify reoccurring weaknesses across parts of the built environment system which now require urgent attention. Let me deal briefly with each incident. With regards to Redcliffe in Verulam, the first investigation concerns the collapse in eThekwini. The site formed part of the River Ranch temple complex in Verulam that I visited a day or so after the tragedy. A temple had already been constructed on the property, and a 5-story reinforced concrete administrative and office building was subsequently erected immediately adjacent to it. At approximately 11:55 on the 12th of December 2025, while concrete was being poured on the upper levels, the building collapsed. 5 people died and 11 were injured. The investigation could not conclusively determine a single technical cause because critical information did either not exist or could not be obtained. No complete structural drawings could be located, no responsible construction team could be identified either, and no built environment professional responsible for the design and supervision of the 5-story building could be positively identified. The investigators did identify several possible technical contributors, including concerns about reinforcement, structural configuration, foundations, concrete, and temporary support. But the clearest findings relate to the regulatory environment in which the building was being constructed. The 5-story building had no approved plans. There was no construction work permit, and the Department of Employment and Labour had not been notified that construction had been commenced. And no building environment professionals had been appointed to provide the professional services required for a project of this nature. This meant that a substantial multi-story building was effectively able to rise and be constructed outside of the formal regulatory system. Because the necessary approvals had not been obtained, the project also did not pass through the ordinary systems of regulatory inspection and oversight. The investigators described Redcliffe as a case of ignoring the law, to quote them. That is the central lesson from this incident. A building of this scale should never have been capable of progressing so far without the necessary approvals, professional oversight, and regulatory visibility. And it calls into question how it got that far without intervention. With regards to Doornkop in Soweto, these circumstances were very different. The collapse occurred at approximately 3 a.m. on the 28th of December 2025, following heavy rainfall in Johannesburg. Part of a 2-story residential structure in Tulani, Extension 2, collapsed, killing a 60-year-old woman, her 24-year-old daughter, and her 1-year-old granddaughter. 3 other occupants were injured. The investigation established that the property was situated on high-risk dolomitic land. Importantly, this danger was already known at the time. A decision had been taken in the late 1990s to relocate residents from the property because of the dolomite risk. Compensation was paid, the property was vacated, and demolition occurred. However, part of the original building remained standing. Years later, another family moved into the abandoned structure. The investigation concludes that the most probable cause of the eventual collapse was a shallow sinkhole or dolline beneath the building, which resulted in the loss of foundational support. But there is a wider governance finding. Government had already identified this land as unsafe, yet the risk was not managed through to its conclusion. The investigation also found weaknesses in Johannesburg's broader management of dolomitic land. These include concerns about whether the required dedicated dolomite risk management capacity had been established, weaknesses in the system used to manage known dolomite risks, shortcomings in preventing unlawful occupation of particularly high-risk land, and inadequate public awareness and hazard reporting mechanisms. The report also points to the presence of other occupied properties within areas previously considered unsafe. Doornkorp therefore raises a broader concern extending beyond a single house. And the lesson is quite simple. Identifying a danger is not enough. Once government knows that land or a structure poses a serious risk to life, that risk has to be actively managed until it is resolved. The investigators described Doornkorp to quote, a case of not enforcing the law. With regards to Magnolia in Sea Point, this incident requires an important distinction. Magnolia is a large residential development under construction on Main Road in Sea Point. On the 17th of February this year, approximately 40 square meters of temporary formwork at level 3 became unstable and failed. There were approximately 140 workers on the site at the time. Four workers were injured, 2 moderately and 2 with minor injuries. The investigation makes clear that this was not the collapse of the permanent structural elements of the building. It was a failure of temporary works during construction. The immediate cause was the premature loading of an incomplete and uninspected temporary works structure. The affected deck had not yet achieved the structural stability required by the design. It had also not been formally inspected and had not been approved for loading. Nevertheless, material was placed onto it without those conditions being met. Unlike Redcliffe and Ormonde, however, the investigation found that the development had complied with the applicable planning requirements and that the necessary professionals had been appointed. A professional health and safety agent was in place, regular safety audits had occurred, and that the incident was investigated internally. The relevant regulatory authorities were also notified, and corrective measures were implemented before any further work continued. Those corrective measures included reassessing temporary works, strengthening inspection and handover requirements before loading, reinforcing safety procedures with workers and contractors, and changing aspects of the system. That does not mean that does not make the incident insignificant. 4 people were obviously injured, but it demonstrates why we must distinguish between these cases. Magnolia shows that even where the regulatory and professional framework is in place, construction stage controls have to operate properly every day. Compliance cannot simply exist in documentation, and every safety control has to operate at the point where work is actually being performed. With regards to Ormonde in Johannesburg, this is the 4th investigation. The building was under construction in Ormonde Extension 50. On the 2nd of March of 2026, while concrete topping was being placed on suspended floors, part of the structure collapsed onto workers below. 9 workers died and 6 were injured. The technical findings are extremely serious. Engineers inspecting the surviving structure identified significant deficiencies in the structural steelwork supporting the suspended floors. The investigation raises concerns about connection details, the selection of structural members, and the overall structural configuration. The steelwork failed while concrete topping was being placed. The investigators concluded that the beams and columns supporting the effective slabs effectively had no capacity to carry the additional live load being applied during this construction operation. Critical construction drawings, design information, and details of structural members requested during the investigation were also not provided, limiting the ability of investigators to verify the design against the applicable standards. The regulatory findings are equally concerning. No application for building approval had been submitted to the City of Johannesburg before the collapse. An application was only submitted after the incident. So after the building collapsed, they then decided to submit an application. The investigation also identified serious concerns about the professional engineering arrangements associated with the development. These included the involvement of an engineer who had been previously deregistered by the Engineering Council of South Africa, as well as questions regarding the competence and role of another registered professional subsequently reflected in statutory documentation. These professional matters have been recommended for further investigation to the Engineering Council of South Africa. The investigation also raises concerns about whether the necessary construction work permit and appropriate health and safety appointments were in place. The investigators describe Omonde as, I quote, a disaster waiting to happen. That is a severe conclusion, ladies and gentlemen. But the technical, regulatory, and professional evidence contained in the report explains why the investigators reached that conclusion. So what do these four separate investigations tell us? When these four cases are considered together, several broader findings become clear. The first is that South Africa does not suffer from a complete absence of legislation governing construction. There is already an existing regulatory framework dealing with planning, building standards, occupational health and safety, professional regulation, municipal approvals, and construction. The principal problem, as we see it, and identified by these investigations, is inconsistent implementation, inadequate oversight, weak enforcement, and non-compliance. At the same time, the report identifies areas in which the regulatory framework itself requires modernization and strengthening. And that distinction is important. We cannot respond to every failure simply by producing another rule. But neither can we ignore areas where existing legislation has become outdated, where penalties no longer provide a meaningful deterrent, or where responsibilities need to be clarified. The second major finding is that significant unlawful construction can remain outside the formal regulatory system. Redcliffe and Omonde are the clearest examples of that. In both cases, substantial construction had progressed without prior building approval. The investigations also raised concerns about the wider practice of construction proceeding first and approval being sought afterwards, and that is completely unacceptable. Building approval is not unnecessary red tape. It is a public safety control. The purpose of obtaining approval before construction is precisely to allow the relevant authority to consider whether what is proposed complies with the law before people are exposed to risk. A system in which substantial construction can proceed and only afterwards be regularized fundamentally weakens that protection and puts people at risk. The third finding concerns what happens after approval has been granted and construction commences. The reports identify an excessive regulatory focus on the initial building plan approval stage. Building control cannot stop when a plan receives a stamp of approval. Authorities need visibility over what happens during construction. They need to know when construction has commenced. They need to know whether what is being built corresponds with what is approved. And they need to know who has accepted professional responsibility. And there must be functional systems for inspection, certification, and ultimately occupational certificates. The fourth finding relates to municipal capacity and capability. Municipalities are at the front line of building regulation. The investigations raise concerns about shortages of suitably qualified building control professionals, limited inspection capacity, and in some cases there is none, and the ability of municipalities to identify construction which has never entered the approval system to begin with. We should not generalize across every municipality. The findings themselves demonstrate materially different circumstances between the municipalities involved. But where capacity constraints exist, they directly affect the ability of the government to protect the public. The reports therefore recommend that the affected municipalities assess and strengthen their building control capacity and enforcement systems. They also raise innovative proposals for improving early detection of major construction activity, including better ward-level reporting and potentially mechanisms through which significant orders of concrete or precast slabs should alert building control authorities to large construction projects taking place within their jurisdiction. The fifth major issue is professional competence and accountability. Professional registration cannot simply mean that someone's name appears on a form. The person accepting responsibility for a structural system must have the actual competence, knowledge, training, and experience required for that particular work. The investigations raise concerns about inadequate supervision, failure to discharge statutory responsibilities, and weaknesses in verifying whether people accepting responsibility for specialized or high-risk work have the required competence to begin with. Where the report recommends further investigation by professional councils, those investigations must now take place. The sixth finding is that our regulators do not share enough information with one another. A municipality may know whether building plans have been approved. The Department of Employment and Labour may hold information about construction notification or construction permits. The NHBRC may know whether a residential development has been enrolled. And professional councils know who is registered and whether a person's registration is in good standing. These are different pieces of information about the same construction project. And if they remain locked in separate systems, warning signs can be missed. The reports therefore recommend improved information sharing between municipalities, the Department of Employment and Labour, the NHBRC, professional councils, and other regulators. The seventh finding concerns consequence management. Where owners, developers, contractors, or professionals deliberately ignore statutory requirements, penalties must provide a real deterrent. The reports recommend that sanctions for violations of planning and construction requirements must be strengthened. They specifically raise the need for far stronger consequences where non-compliance contributes to death or serious injury. They also recommend stronger consequences for ignoring stop work notices, and people cannot regard compliance with building legislation as optional because the financial consequences of breaking the law are less significant than the financial benefits of continuing the construction. That balance must change. Taken together, these are not four isolated lessons. They reinforce weaknesses that government has now seen emerge across successive structural incidents. So what is the link then to the George issue that we have previously dealt with? These findings also reinforce a number of lessons identified following the George building collapse. The circumstances of George, Redcliffe, Doornkop, Magnolia, and Ormonde are not identical, but reoccurring issues are evident. These include the need for stronger professional accountability, improved information sharing, greater visibility of construction activity, better systems for reporting structural incidents, improved verification of professional competence, and a modernization of our regulatory framework. One of the important recommendations emerging from these investigations is that government needs to become better at detecting risks before tragedy occurs. That has to be our objective. As I've said before, we must be frank in acknowledging that repeated collapses point to deeper structural issues that must be urgently reviewed to improve building safety and construction oversight. As we work to turn South Africa into a construction site, it's critical that we do so in an environment where building construction can be trusted and the loss of life avoided. Increasing the scale and scale of construction cannot come at the expense of safety. In fact, the more that we build, the more important effective building control, competent professionals, proper construction management, and strong enforcement become. So, what happens next? The investigations presented today cannot simply conclude with the publications of findings. The recommendations now need to be considered and acted upon by the institutions that are responsible for them. I've directed the Council for the Built Environment to formally share the relevant findings and recommendations arising from these investigations with the respective municipalities and other affected stakeholders, and to engage them directly on the findings and proposed interventions. This approach ensures that the release of the findings is led by the Minister on behalf of government, while also demonstrating that the next phase will be undertaken collaboratively with the affected municipalities and stakeholders. Where a finding requires investigation by professional counsel, it will be referred to so. Where recommendations concern municipal building control, risk management systems or enforcement, that municipality must act. And where recommendations require action by national government or changes to the regulatory framework, those recommendations should be considered by the responsible institutions, including myself. Where information arising from these investigations may be relevant for possible criminal conduct, it is and will be made available to the appropriate law enforcement authorities. It's important, however, that we respect due process. These reports identify technical, regulatory, governance, and professional failures. They do not determine criminal or civil liability. That responsibility ultimately rests with the appropriate investigative authorities, professional disciplinary processes, and the courts. We must therefore avoid prejudging those processes. I also want to make it clear that the 4 reports being discussed today do not represent the end of our work in relation to recent structural incidents. Following the collapse of a retaining wall at the Nazareth Baptist Church, also known as the Shembe Church, at Ibuhleni in Inanda in July, the CBE was requested to support government's response through a technical and public protection intervention. The CBE is working with the Shembe Church leadership to coordinate the necessary multidisciplinary professional expertise to assess their sites. Importantly, the intervention will seek to establish and identify the technical and other factors that contributed to that collapse that injured a number of people. The work will therefore include the necessary technical and geotechnical assessments, engineering investigations, and design work to understand the causes of that failure and to develop a safe, technical, and implementation-ready solution for the affected area and their continued construction. This intervention is still early, and it's even innovative by working with such a large organization like that, which does construction across the country. Further information on the Ebuhleni intervention will be communicated as the technical work progresses. Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of the investigations we are presenting today was to establish what happened, and importantly, what these incidents tell us about the system responsible for protecting you, the public. The answer is not that every construction site in South Africa is unsafe, nor is the answer that every municipality, regulator, or built environment professional a failure. The evidence does not support either conclusion. The answer is that there are identified weaknesses in our system, which in some cases have allowed dangerous or unlawful construction to proceed, reduced the ability of local authorities to intervene, weakened professional accountability, and left known risks inadequately managed. At Magnolia, the evidence also shows that even within an otherwise compliant project, a failure to apply a critical construction safety control can result in a serious incident. And those distinctions do matter. But so does the common responsibility arising from all of our investigations. Where there are gaps, we must close them, and where enforcement is weak, we must strengthen them. Where municipalities require stronger capacity, that must be addressed. And where government already knows that there's a serious risk, the risk cannot be left unresolved. 17 people died in 4 incidents before we meet here today. That number should remain at the center of our response. The families who lost loved ones deserve to know what happened and why it happened. The workers who enter construction sites across South Africa every morning deserve a system which does everything reasonably possible to keep them safe. And South Africans deserve to know that when a building is erected in their community, the law has been followed, competent people have designed and supervised it, and the authorities responsible for protecting the public are able to do their jobs. If we're serious about turning South Africa into a construction site, then we should be equally serious about ensuring that South Africa becomes a safe construction site. That is the responsibility these findings now place before us. I'll hand over to the chairperson of the board, Ms. Amelia Mchali, who will speak about the importance of these investigations and the role they must play. And then she will be followed by the CEO, Dr. Mieza, who will then detail the findings arising from each of the 4 investigations. Thank you very much. Ms. Mchali.
Honorable Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure, Mr. Dean McPherson, the leadership of the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, the Chief Executive of the Council for the Built Environment, members of media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning.
Morning.
So as the Council for the Built Environment, we welcome the opportunity today to account for an important commitment to our mandate, which is protecting the public through investigation of incidents that affect the safety and integrity of South Africa's built environment. Before we discuss the technical findings, regulatory systems, and also the recommendation, we must always remember that behind these investigations, behind these incidences that happens, there are people involved. There are people whose lives are infected or affected with these tragic incidences that are happening. Public protection is in the heart of us as Council for the Built Environment. It's in the heart of our mandate. The Council for the Built Environment's involvement in this investigation is not incidental. It is a requirement as part of our mandate. Public protection is at the heart of why CBE exists. The Council for the Built Environment Act empowers CBE to advise the government on matters falling within the built environment, including those concerning public health and safety, to undertake investigations where necessary, to facilitate cooperation across government, and to make recommendations where improvements to our policies, to our regulations, and legislation is required. When a building collapses, particularly where lives are lost, we have a responsibility to understand not only what physically failed, but also what within the systems allowed the failure to occur. As you know, our mandate as the built environment regulating all the professional councils, so all the professions, including the architecture, including engineering, landscape architecture, project and construction management. We've got property valuations. We've got quantity surveyors. environmentalists, geomatics, and planners, it is our responsibility that we embrace our mandate fully. This is why the investigations that have happened really matters. That expectation places an enormous responsibility on the professionals, on contractors, developers, regulators, municipalities, and public institutions entrusted with the planning, designs, approval, constructions, and the oversight of the built environment. Investigations must lead to prevention. The purpose of these investigations cannot simply to be producing of reports, especially where we've got lives that have been lost. The real value lies in the lessons we extract from them, and most importantly, what we do differently as a consequence. Each incident provides us with an opportunity to examine the entire chain of responsibilities, from planning and building approvals through professional designs and construction to inspections, enforcement, and ultimately occupation. These findings we are announcing today therefore help us shape our built environment that is increasingly preventative rather than reactive, and build a better regulation system. The finding of this investigation reinforced broader direction that we've already pursued as part of the Council for the Built Environment's Amendment Bill, which will be gazetted for the public consultation by the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure Policy Branch in the coming weeks. Furthermore, we have developed the National Built Environment and Construction Safety Framework, which seeks to move the country from fragmented oversight towards coordinated systems that prioritizes prevention, enforcement, and accountability. This brings me to an important aspect of the work that CBE does before us, the intergovernmental relations. The safety of South Africa's built environment does not reside within the mandate of a single institution or a single sphere of government. Municipalities have a critical responsibility for building plans approvals, building controls, inspections, and occupation. National departments exercise responsibility relating to construction health and safety, legislation, and policy. Professional bodies regulate registered built environment professionals. Other regulatory bodies hold important information relating to development and construction activities. Each institution is therefore holding a piece of public-related systems and the safety thereof. This is why cooperative governments and intergovernmental coordinations are not simply administrative principles in the context of the built environment. They are public safety mechanisms. From findings to implementation, as Governing Council of the CBE, we are particularly concerned of these investigations. It should just not end with the findings that we are sharing with you today. The measure of their success will be whether the recommendations lead to change in the practices within the built environment. And we would like to assure you that we would like to have a safer built environment. And ultimately, the work we are discussing today is about more than the 4 investigations that the Minister have highlighted today. It is about the kind of built environment we want South Africa to have. We have a built environment in which public can be confident that buildings are properly planned, designed, and are constructed. That is how the investigations will contribute to shaping a better built environment, not simply by explaining what has went wrong, but by helping the government and the sector to ensure that same failures don't happen in the future. the Council for the Built Environment remains committed to working with the Honourable Minister of the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, all spheres of government, our professional councils that I've highlighted earlier, industries, communities to advance the objective. Our responsibility is ultimately public safety. And our collective task is to ensure that the built environment within South Africa lives, work, and build their future, which is safe, professionally delivered, effectively regulated, and worthy of the trust. It is important that the reports that Dr. Mieza is going to be sharing with us today really enforces on the findings that have been highlighted. I will therefore call Dr. Mieza to come and share with us the technical findings from these investigations that the Minister have highlighted, and what can we learn out of those investigations? What can we learn from the findings that will be highlighted so that the same is not repeated going forward? I thank you.
Honourable Minister Dean McPherson, Chairperson Mem Jali, and members of the media and my colleagues from the Department of Public Works, and generally the colleagues that we work with in the space. Minister McPherson, the benefit of speaking last, after you especially, is that my job becomes that of summarizing, because the Minister has covered ground. And I think the chairperson has also explained the role we play in the ecosystem. So mine really is to amplify some of the key issues with the hope that when we engage with the respective municipalities and the colleagues, as well as the developers that we've worked with, we'll be able to share some more details. Allow me to also restate that mine is not to repeat what the Minister has covered, but I'll try and excavate some of the issues that the Minister would have not been able to cover. From the onset, I do want to place on record that we make the following observations from the report that we've compiled. That there is a concern arising from the construction sector that relates to retrospective or post-facto building approvals. There are various reasons that are advanced by either developers or municipalities. I think the Minister covered some of the issues pertaining to capacity, our response time, and generally how we process developments. We also make an observation that this is motivated by the fact that where a full year has passed between the commencement of a construction project and eventual approval, the applicable fine may amount to approximately 36,000 rand. So surely you can agree with me that there is no incentive for people not to comply with the law because they can accommodate that particular amount. And I think that's one of the recommendations that we are making in the report, to review the penalties that are imposed on developers that proceed without due process. Our submission really relates to the fact that the question that we must answer is about public safety, on whether the structure that we are constructing is safe or it's good enough to be habitable by communities. And I think that's really the issue, because our regulatory environment is premised on that. So therefore, each investigation report, there are 4 of them, basically revealed layers that must be considered moving into the future, amongst others, the intelligence, the patterns, the systems, as well as weaknesses and signposts that must guide our reforms. I do want to restate this, Minister and members of the media, the importance of the legislation, because as I indicate some of the non-compliance or contraventions, you must link them back to the legislation that governs the constructions of multi-story buildings in our country. I want to commence with the National Building Regulations and Building Standards Act of 1997, which is the basis that we use to build structures in this country. The second piece of legislation that is important is the Housing Consumer Protection Measures Act. The third one is Occupational Health and Safety Act. The last one is the Council for the Built Environment Act 43 of 2000, which relates to the scope of work assigned to various built environment practitioners. These legislations collectively are the instruments that establishes the gates or key decision points that are important in the construction cycle. For example, Gate 1 is about planning. Gate 2 is about procurement and related aspects, up until Gate 3, which is really about post-construction. And I think these gates are important because you have to plan, you have to notify the authorities that you're about to commence construction, you need to get a permit from Department of Labor, then you can start construction, and you need to get occupant certificate when the construction has been concluded. And I think that is the essence of these gates. They also place a responsibility on professionals who becomes competent person responsible for the entire project. And I think that's the ethical responsibility, competence that is required from the built environment professionals who must assist clients and government in the supervision and construction of projects. I think the minister spoke about George and what has happened since then, because these incidents are becoming occurrent. We have established what we call emergency incident response protocol. This protocol is the one that we use to galvanize each other as a team to ensure that we work together collectively with the Department of Labor and other role players, emergency services, SABC, municipalities, to ensure that we respond timelessly. We have titled this report Pearls of Wisdom because it consolidates what the minister was covering in his address in different aspects. And really what I'm going to explain now relates to different aspects. So in relation to River Range, we only look at 4 areas. I think the minister gave you an overall storyline. I'm going to start with the limitations that we encountered in these particular investigations, and then highlight some of the structural design, construction, and material deficiencies that we observed. And thirdly, deal with the issues of competence or professional teams that was involved in this particular project. And lastly, the issue of regulatory compliance. I do need to state upfront that some of the findings that we're making on the River Range Temple especially are based on the information that we're able to uncover, because you might have known that the person or the trustee members that were responsible for this project, all of them lost their lives. However, we can confirm that the trustees, with no limited or with no experience in construction or built environment, functioned as an owner and a builder. Remember the National Building Regulation and Standards. It says you must appoint a competent team. That was the first contravention. The same trustee took responsibility for management, design, and construction, meaning that there was no professional team on this particular project. The same trustee ordered ready-mix concrete for the slabs without any construction experience. He also supplied hand-drawn sketches for the slabs. It's not clear to us where did he get those sketches, but those sketches were used for the reinforcement of the structure that collapsed. Surely, without the technical advice, without professionals around the project, the catastrophe that was experienced was expected. The second issue, which I think the minister covered, is the issue of non-compliance. Basically, in this project, we conclude that there was just disregard of the legal requirements governing the construction of high-rise stories. Critically also, we're able to identify some of the professionals who might have interacted with this project. However, most of them either misled the investigating team or they were not willing to participate. Obviously, in the absence of the owner who had passed on, there was nothing that was compelling us or was able to assist us to hold them responsible for what they did. In the main, I think the minister did cover that the reinforcements that we saw on that particular project, you can easily see that professionally they were not designed up to standard. Conclusively, we can conclude that that building collapsed because there were fundamental deficiencies in the design and the construction of columns. Now, let me move to Doornkop. I think the minister spent time on that one, so I will only touch on a few issues. In relation to Doornkop, we can confirm that the area indeed was dolomitic. However, our submission is that if it had been designed or supervised by a professionally competent individual, it would have likely to meet the standards. For those colleagues who might be familiar with Centurion, the most part of Centurion is dolomitic, and there are engineering solutions that are available to construct in the dolomitic areas. So the fact that that particular project or that particular house was not subjected to scrutiny when it collapsed, it was because of some of the engineering deficiencies. So conclusively, we also conclude that that building collapsed because of the shallow door line beneath the central portion. The foundation failed, which led to the cracks that led to the building ultimately subsiding. As you might know, the building has already been demolished by the City of Joburg. The minister also covered great length about the Omonde project. Just for structuring purposes, we looked at 4 areas: the planning, statutory approval, regulatory compliance. Number 2, professional registration, competence and accountability. Number 3, the site condition, building configuration, as well as structural complexities. Number 4, design deficiencies and collapse mechanism. The Omonde investigation for us revealed an equally alarming scenario. The minister did indicate that the building and the site that was constructed on that particular structure, it was not approved. All what we know now from our investigation is that the application was only made retrospectively, which is a contravention for the National Building Regulation and Building Standards Act, as well as the city bylaws. We can also confirm that in Omonde, a health and safety agent registered with SCPMP should have been appointed, and also that the construction work permit should have been acquired, but none of those were undertaken. That's a responsibility that is imposed on the developer or the owner of the property. The minister also indicated that the engineer that was working on that particular project was unregistered. When we actually interviewed the engineer, he did confirm to us that he was working under a supervision of a professionally registered engineer. However, in our engagement with this particular colleague, he did not provide any more detail. Basically, he did not participate in the conversation. We're able also to speak to an architect who confirmed to us that he was not aware that the project had commenced. And secondly, his design vis-a-vis what was being constructed had anomalies. He had warned the developer that some of the encroachments that were actually observed under the Eskom power line were not legal. Nonetheless, it proceeded. He also confirmed that he was not appointed for other stages. He was only appointed for first phases only on that particular project, which is another issue that we feel was a non-compliance. I think the minister spoke at length about what caused to the collapse. In the main, it was the rotation of beams, it was the failure of the columns because of the rotation, as well as the unusual structural configuration because of the inadequate detailing of beams as well as column interface. We are of the view that the fact that there was a use of unregistered personnel, the project could have been handled better. However, we all know what transpired on that particular project. In summary, for us in relation to Omonde, we think the usage of unqualified individuals who assume construction role, lack of professional oversight, insufficient reinforcement, design integrity, and blatant disregard of regulatory enforcement was the cause for the collapse. Coming to Magnolia in Sea Point, Minister did indicate that this was not a building collapse. But what happened was that during the staging phase, a section of temporary work under construction partially collapsed. The structure was neither loaded with concrete nor reinforced at the time. Emergency services responded and the site was secured in the same afternoon. However, we wish to place on record that on this particular project, we were able to receive all the necessary documentation pertaining to the development. The cooperation from the city, as well as from the developer, was useful for us in coming out to the following findings. One, the professional health and safety agent developed a comprehensive baseline assessment and a project construction health and safety tender specification. The professional health and safety agent also confirmed that all the competencies of appointments were legally compliant. They also confirmed in their report that they used to conduct regular compliance safety audits and prepare comprehensive and professional internal investigation post the event. So we're able to triangulate from the documentation and based on our professional expertise. However, the cause of the collapse was because of a premature loading of an incomplete and uninspected temporary structure. Basically, the deck had not met the design stability requirements. We can confirm that the deck had not received also clearance before the material were craned onto it. We also do want to highlight one issue, which is something that we have raised with the developers, and I think they are attending to it. Relates to the expired certification of competence of the formwork supervisor. And that matter was flagged in their report, and it's a matter that they were dealing with. In summary, the minister did say that in a construction project, you are likely to experience incidents. So, Minister, as we table the pearls of wisdom, we want this report to be understood as an intelligence and assessment on what we must do moving forward. Ours is not to apportion criminal guilt, civil liability, or professional misconduct. We also accept that each regulator, public entity, government entity has its own mandate, must test the information we're presenting today against its own funding legislation. As the CPE, as directed by the minister, we will be engaging with the City of eThekwini, City of Cape Town, as well as City of Joburg, where we'll be sharing some of the findings, as well as colleagues from the provincial and national government departments, that we make findings on our report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mieza. Colleagues, we're now going to open the floor for questions. I'm going to open it for the room first. You can just raise your hand, mention your name and which title you're from, and who your question is directed to. Just give an indication back there, yeah?
Question is, clearly there is a repetition, but there is will. We will. But when will we see actual tangible outcome in holding those accountable? Because the further the delay, the longer the problems linger. And Minister, my question is directed to you particularly. As a department, you've just received this report. What are you planning, to implement? What are the steps that you've taken to fully address these challenges, which you say are of urgency, but what does a practical form look like, and when can we expect that?
Thank you so much. Any other questions in the room? Just a reminder that we are also online on GCIS and Public Works, so those joining online can ask the questions. Yes.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. It's Chekwani Gladi from ENCA. I just want to know if there are any plans or any model to detect these non-compliance while the building is still during the construction or before occupancy. And then the other thing is, I think I heard the minister said some of the buildings complied with everything, but then unfortunately there were those crises. So is there any way in which something can be done with regard to find out as well as to what are the causes and what is the plan of avoiding that going forward?
Is that in relation to the low level that kids are? Cool.
Thank you.
Neria Shakota from the SABC. I just want to speak to the issue of consequence management. The minister did indicate that if in the report, if it warrants that things be taken to law enforcement, it should. But have we seen any of the cases already being taken to law enforcement? Are we expecting perhaps people to go through consequence management of some sort, because there is that issue of penalties, but beyond the penalties themselves, is there charges to be laid against these people? Actually, yes.
Thank you so much. It's a final question for this round. Go on. Cool. Should we do one? Colleagues, we're going to finish all the questions now, so this is going to be the last opportunity. Vanessa, any questions online?
No questions online.
I'm going to close the session then with that. Cool. Thanks so much, Minister. Over to you.
Sorry, I know that we also have to get to the President's event at 12, and I'm sure many of you will be there, so we'll wrap up quite shortly. So the question around planning or implementation, our primary starting point was the George collapse in 2024. We have held significant discussions and consultations on that. We have finalized a memorandum for Cabinet that we will be taking forward there that concretizes the measures that we either need to see legislatively or regulatory. And you had heard from Ms. Mchali that we will be bringing forward the CBE amendment bill that also takes some of those points out of the reports, and that is really a joint report between ourselves, Department of Labour, Human Settlements, and DTIC. When it comes to law enforcement, obviously I'm not in the law enforcement game, but I think that we share the view that people cannot die because of professional misconduct and then you just get a fine for that. In any other sector, if your professional misconduct led to the deaths of people, that would be at the very least considered manslaughter, maybe murder. if there was intent behind it. And I see no reason why we should not approach the same in the construction industry. That people cannot just die and you either get deregistered as a professional or you get given a fine. And that's why the George issue has been so important to us, and we have really done everything that we can to provide prosecutors with the evidence that they need to prove that there was misconduct, that all of the warning signs were ignored, and that's what led to the deaths of 34 people. Now, I know that the issue is with the prosecuting authority and with the police, and I think that when that will be enrolled or when that will come forward is best placed to them. But we obviously are very keen to see what comes out of that, because that is evidence that we have supplied to the police, to the investigators, and we also requested, with the support of Minister Kachalia, that the same police investigators that were at George were dispatched to the eThekwini investigation, because there obviously was other people that died there. So I'm not content with just seeing fines dished out. I do not think that is a sufficient deterrent, and I think for so long as that is the worst case scenario, people will continue to cut corners, and it's why a deregistered engineer can be bold enough to be involved in an unlawful development in Omonde, because, well, what would you do? Who would you fine if you're not even registered anymore? So there's got to be more serious consequences. And I have really taken the lead of, I think, at least the safety approach that mining has taken, and this speaks to the ENCA question, is that even when you do something 100% compliant, there still may be failures. That is unfortunately the nature of construction. That it could be determined by the weather. It could be something in the value chain that an engineer is not aware of. But we have to limit the possibility of death and injury. And so we think by placing these guardrails in place and stepping up our efforts, that we can start to lower that rate, and that instead of having 17 people die in a year, that we eventually want to work down to 0. That should be our target. Our target shouldn't be 10 or 5. It should be 0 deaths and 0 injuries in a year. In terms of detection, and I think that this is part of the point that we make, is that we are not responsible for bylaw enforcement or planning enforcement. Municipalities really have to step up and take that on. And I think that speaks to the point that we saw in eThekwini in Johannesburg, is that these were buildings that had no approved planning. And the fact that they were being built should have been a red flag. And I went to that eThekwini thing, the eThekwini collapse at least, and if you drove past on the road, it was striking. You couldn't have missed it. That a 5-story concrete block had gone up, and no one thought to say or do anything or report it. And I think that we have to work really hard with municipalities to capacitate that enforcement, because again, if you know that you can literally put up a 5-story concrete block and no one will do anything, well, of course you'd want to you will get away with it and continue to do so. So everyone has to play their roles, and we think by working with municipalities and helping them to do their role, that they would be able to deal with that. I think lastly I would say that obviously we are notionally the custodians of the built environment, and this is what's incredibly frustrating for, I think, us as a team, is that while we are the custodians, we don't have say on the full value chain of the built environment. And that's part of the reform that we advocate for is that if we have a building environment custodian like ourselves, we need to be able to speak to, direct, and provide that oversight of the full value chain to reduce those deaths. I don't know if the Chair or CEO would like to add anything further.
Colleagues, with that, we bring to a close the press briefing. Thank you so much for coming to this morning. Also, just want to mention with the gracious hosts of the CBE, they've organised refreshments for all the journalists in the room. So just turn right through reception at the boardrooms at the back. There will be refreshments for everyone here today. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely day further. Thank you.
I have a question for the media, actually. Do you get
ClickUp AI Note Taker is different than all the rest. It allows you to focus on your meetings, not your notes. It captures everything, from action items to key decisions. And after every call, you get a clear summary. But where it really goes to the next level is that it's the only AI note